In the early spring of 1986, a demolition crew was hired to assess structural damage at a derelict chapel located on the outskirts of Bristol County, Vermont, a place locals had long since stopped speaking about. Officially, the property was listed as Parcel 14D, Briarcliff Monastery. By then, it had sat vacant for over 3 years. The work order was unremarkable: remove rotting pews, assess flooring integrity, and document potential asbestos contamination. It was routine work for men who had spent most of their lives tearing down the remnants of older New England. But on the second day, while removing a section of warped flooring near the altar, a foreman named Peter Keck struck something solid, not stone, not brick, but hollow metal. Beneath the planks, wedged in the crawl space beneath the sanctuary, was a steel lockbox, its exterior rusted through and sealed shut with a brittle padlock. When the box was pried open, it didn't contain church documents or financial records, as they expected. Inside was a single object, a thick leather-bound ledger. The pages were yellowed, damp, but intact. Handwritten in faded black ink, every line contained the same 3 elements: a name, an age, and a date. The entries began in April of 1969. They ended in October of 1983. There were 199 names, no titles, no causes of death, no explanations. The first entry read, Eleanor F. Granger, age 11, April 7th, 1969. The last, Matthew J. Corson, age 17, October 4th, 1983. The ledger was turned over to the Bristol County Sheriff's Department. It was placed in a brown evidence envelope, marked with the file number BC 1986-044, and filed into a cabinet at the County Records Annex. No follow-up was recorded, no investigation was launched, and no press statement was issued. The official reason given later was a lack of criminal context. The monastery, after all, had been closed for years. There were no bodies, no complaints, just names. Names that, on the surface, meant nothing. But not everyone forgot. A year later, in 1987, a freelance researcher named Harold Dreer, compiling material for a historical society exhibit on vanished religious orders, requested access to the Briarcliff case file. What he found unnerved him. Of the 199 names in the ledger, 84 matched known persons from surrounding counties. 12 were listed in missing persons bulletins between 1969 and 1980. 9 had previously been declared wards of the state, and 1, a boy named Darren Holt, age 13, had reportedly died in a car accident 3 years before the date listed beside his name. The remaining 115 names? No records, no birth certificates, no known next of kin. It was as if they had never existed. Briarcliff Monastery had been founded in 1891 by a Benedictine order known as the Congregation of Sacred Silence, a cloistered community that prided itself on discipline, poverty, and absolute seclusion. The compound was built on over 70 acres of dense forest land, donated by a local textile magnate whose own son had suffered from what was then called unquiet spirit. The land was chosen for its remoteness, no towns within walking distance, no paved roads. The monks grew their own food, raised livestock, and accepted only occasional deliveries from a single local grocer, who recalled the men as always solemn and always in pairs. In the 1960s, during a period of financial hardship for the church, Briarcliff was granted special status as a residential spiritual facility. This meant they could accept temporary boarders, men and boys deemed emotionally disturbed or morally defective. The decision was largely bureaucratic. The state needed housing for juvenile offenders and the chronically institutionalized. The church needed funding. For the next 14 years, the monastery received quiet transfers from orphanages, juvenile detention centres, and private families. No one paid much attention until the ledger surfaced. Today, the grounds of Briarcliff remain inaccessible to the public. The structure itself is mostly collapsed. Moss creeps across the chapel's crumbled stone. Trees have overgrown the eastern wing. But in 1993, a small documentary crew was given permission to film what was left of the site. Among them was sound technician Jim Rottweiler, who had grown up in Bristol and remembered the stories. Strange lights in the forest, barefoot figures on the roadside, a schoolmate who'd been sent up to the monks and never returned. What struck Jim most wasn't what they found, it was what was missing. The walls still bore the outline of crucifixes, long since removed. The chapel had Latin phrases carved into its beams. Corpus meum vocat silentium. My body calls for silence. But there were no personal items, no Bibles, no letters, no photographs. As if every trace of human life had been stripped out, piece by piece. Only one man who worked at the monastery during its final decade ever agreed to speak publicly. His name was Alphonse Creeley, a former groundskeeper, 74 years old at the time of his interview in 1995. He described the monks as quiet, rigid, and always watching. They didn't smile, he said, didn't touch the children, not like you'd think, but they were strict, wouldn't let the boys speak to us, wouldn't let them walk alone. One time I saw a child try to climb the fence near the garden. Brother Matthias caught him and carried him back inside, over his shoulder, like a sack of flour. Alphonse remembered that same boy being gone the next day. No explanation, no goodbye. That's just how it worked. If someone disappeared, you didn't ask. In 2001, historian Ruth Keller, who specialised in post-Vatican II institutional closures, published a paper titled Sanctified Silence: The Lost Orders of Northern Vermont. It included a chapter on Briarcliff Monastery. According to diocesan records, accessed under legal pretext, Briarcliff had received nearly $2.4 million into unaccounted subsidies between 1970 and 1982. Internal memos indicated non-public placements and privately arranged admissions, mostly between the ages of 8 and 17. When Keller contacted the Diocese of Montport for comment, she was told the records had since been destroyed in a flood, but no flood was recorded in the area during that time. She concluded her chapter with the following sentence: what the state viewed as social relief, the church categorized as penance, and in the absence of oversight, those two concepts were made indistinguishable. The ledger itself, catalogued under evidence file BC 1986-044, was quietly removed from public access in 2005. Its current location is unknown. But not all traces were lost. A photocopy made by researcher Harold Dreer surfaced in a law journal in 2010. While most of the names have never been matched, some are unmistakable. Beatrice Hillman, age 9, missing from Rutland County in 1971. Jasper Nolan, age 12, last seen entering juvenile custody in 1974. Corinne Meyer, age 14, reported as a runaway in 1978, never located. Each name is paired with a date. Each date, it appears, marks the final day that child was ever seen alive. What makes this story particularly chilling is that it wasn't driven by religious fanaticism or supernatural forces, but by something far more terrifying: the administrative banality of human disposal. There were no curses, no rituals, just files signed, children moved, and records deleted. What happened at Briarcliff was not madness, it was procedure, a system of isolation, a hierarchy of obedience, a culture where suffering was rationalized, not in secret, but in silence. It is a mistake to think that horror must wear the face of chaos. Sometimes it wears a robe, speaks softly, and writes names into a ledger with perfect penmanship. By the time the monastery was formally shut down in late 1983, no public hearing was held. No investigation was opened. The property was deconsecrated and transferred to the county for a symbolic fee of $1. No effort was made to trace the whereabouts of those previously housed there. No accounting of the vanished. To this day, no one has been charged. The building's final census listed 27 residents. The ledger suggests there were at least 199 With the chapel partially demolished, the rest of the grounds sealed off, and the documents scattered or lost, the story of Briarcliff might have remained another local myth, exaggerated and forgotten. But in certain archives, in copies filed under forgotten academic papers and mislabeled folders, the names remain. And with them, a question too large to ignore. How does a Catholic monastery lose 199 people? In 1970, the Briarcliff Monastery was listed in the Vermont Department of Human Services as a private religious institution providing non-clinical custodial care for individuals with long-term behavioural challenges. The language was vague by design. The Catholic Diocese of Montport had long lobbied for exemptions that allowed monastic orders to receive residents without the administrative burden of oversight. That year, the monastery submitted its first official census. The document, a one-page typewritten form, listed 23 male residents between the ages of 8 and 44. Each was categorised under one of three behavioural descriptors: incorrigible, feral, or damaged from birth. There were no medical histories attached, no birth records, no signatures of consent. By state standards at the time, this was not unusual. Under the Special Placement Act of 1967, minors deemed unfit for public schooling could be transferred into faith-based custodial environments with parental approval or judicial referral. Many of the boys who arrived at Briarcliff came from juvenile institutions or orphanages slated for closure. Others were handed over informally, their files filled with phrases like unsuitable for home environment or requires moral correction. 2 years later, in 1972, Briarcliff submitted its second census. This time, the form listed only 14 residents. There was no notation about transfers, deaths or discharges, no hospital records, no requests for transportation. 9 individuals, all of them children, were simply no longer present. The discrepancy would have passed unnoticed if not for a young social worker named Angela Lorne. She had joined the Department of Child Welfare in early 1972 after completing her graduate internship at a juvenile psychiatric centre in Barrow. Angela was meticulous, reserved, and unusually focused on paper trails, traits that earned her both admiration and quiet avoidance from her colleagues. Her assignment to Briarcliff was coincidental. She had been reviewing quarterly subsidy forms and noticed that the monastery had continued to receive funding for 23 residents, despite the latest census listing only 14. On July 18th of that year, Angela drove up the narrow gravel path that led to the edge of the Briarcliff property. The road was uneven, poorly maintained, flanked by pine and birch trees that closed in like sentinels. She arrived just before 10 a.m. and was met at the gate by a man in a plain grey cassock who introduced himself only as Brother Nathaniel. He offered no handshake. Angela would later describe the air as smelling like cedar and mildew and something metallic. She was escorted inside without her clipboard. It was taken from her hand with a gentle but firm motion and placed on a side table in the entry hall. Her observations, recorded that same evening in a confidential department memo, paint a picture of an institution far removed from any recognisable standard of care. The interior of Briarcliff was dim. Most windows were covered with heavy cloth. The only sound came from a slow-turning fan in the chapel vestibule. Angela noted that several of the children appeared sedated. One boy, whom she estimated to be around 9 years old, was sitting on a stool near the hallway stairs, staring at the floor. His lips moved, but no sound emerged. When Angela asked his name, a monk nearby answered for him. His name is Joseph. Later, while reviewing the resident chart presented to her, Angela found the same boy listed under a different name, Martin. The discrepancy was small, a clerical error perhaps, but it would stay with her. Angela's full letter, later found in a disused personnel file cabinet in Montport, is 6 pages long. In it she wrote, "The children appear to exist in a state of suspended cognition. Their reactions to sound, movement, or verbal prompting are delayed or absent. I observed 3 individuals with what appear to be signs of long-term benzodiazepine exposure, including motor rigidity, flattened affect, and unresponsiveness to novel stimuli. She also expressed concern about the facility's record keeping. Multiple residents had incomplete intake forms. Others had mismatched dates of arrival. One entry listed the same date of birth for 2 different individuals, both marked as non-verbal. She requested an immediate follow-up visit. It never came. On August 4, 1972, Angela was reassigned to administrative filing in Burlington. Her inquiry into Briarcliff was marked non-actionable by her department's internal review panel, citing insufficient grounds for escalation. The visit was never followed up, no audit was conducted, and from that point forward, no further visits to Briarcliff by any social worker were recorded in state logs. Angela left the Department of Child Welfare the following spring. She never spoke publicly about the visit again. The world outside Briarcliff, meanwhile, remained unaware. The monastery's funding continued. Private donations increased, fueled by religious benefactors who saw the monks' work as a noble act of mercy toward the unwanted. Tax records show that by 1975, Briarcliff had received over $400,000 in unrestricted gifts. And yet the census numbers continued to fluctuate without explanation. In 1973, 17 residents. In 1974, 19. By 1976, 12, names changed, ages reset. Sometimes a boy listed one year would appear the next under a different surname. And through it all, no external observer ever stepped foot inside the monastery again. There is a photograph taken in 1972 of the hallway where Angela had first seen the boy called Martin. The image was captured by a diocesan visitor documenting facility maintenance. In the background, faint but visible, a child is seated on a low wooden bench. His hands are folded neatly in his lap. His face is turned slightly away, blurred by motion. But a small detail stands out. On the floor beside him is a red leather shoe, a single child's shoe, untied. In Angela's letter, she wrote that the boy near the stairs had only one shoe. It would take another 15 years before Briarcliff was officially closed. By then, the walls had begun to collapse. Feral animals roamed the grounds. Trees grew through the crumbling eastern dormitory. The silence had grown thick, calcified, protected by time, bureaucracy, and disinterest. When asked decades later why no one followed up on Angela's report, a retired state director said flatly, "There were too many places like that. We couldn't track them all." But this wasn't just about lost paperwork or mismanaged care. The horror of Briarcliff lies in its erasure, the methodical disappearance of names, voices, and memories, not by violence, but by omission. What makes this chapter uniquely disturbing is how little it takes to hide people when the world stops asking questions. A census changes by 9 entries. A girl becomes a boy becomes 2 names, and a red shoe sits quietly in the shadows of an unvisited hallway. There is no record of where the missing 9 children from 1972 went. No transfer files, no grave markers. Their trail ends in a building whose walls were built to hold sound in, not let it out. And Angela Lorne, whose brief contact with those walls left her unsettled for the rest of her life, is the only reason we know they ever existed. With the 1972 census discrepancy ignored and oversight effectively severed, Briarcliff was left to operate with near total autonomy for the next 11 years. Their next internal intake log would list a boy named Charles Renner, age 11, who would later appear under the name Isaac in a 1979 report. The renaming was no longer clerical, it had become ritual, and with each change, the silence inside Briarcliff deepened. In the autumn of 1975, the ancient stones of Briarcliff Monastery seemed to absorb the chill that came down from the Berkshire Hills. Perched atop a ridge of rock and pine, the monastery was as much fortress as sanctuary. a grim relic of 19th century penitential architecture. Its high walls were streaked black with decades of soot and rain. The iron gates at its entrance bore no welcome, only the pitted, rusted scars of age. For those unfamiliar with its reputation, Briarcliff was simply a cloistered community of men dedicated to silence and prayer. But for the few who crossed its threshold that year, the monastery felt less like a house of God and more like a place abandoned by him. Elias was 23 when he arrived, newly ordained, his cassock still stiff at the seams. His assignment to Briarcliff was meant to be a season of reflection before he would take his permanent vows. The abbey's isolation was seen as ideal for cultivating spiritual discipline. His superiors described it as a place where the world's noise cannot reach. What they failed to mention was that what lay within could be far more deafening. From the first night, Elias felt the weight of Briarcliff's silence, not the peace of contemplation, but the oppressive hush of a place where sound itself seemed unwelcome. The corridors, lined with heavy oak doors and narrow windows, swallowed footsteps. The air smelled faintly of damp stone and candle wax, touched by a sour trace of mildew that no incense could mask. The monks he met in those early days were courteous but distant, their eyes avoiding his, their voices barely above a whisper. No names were exchanged beyond what was necessary, and even those seemed to vanish after being spoken, as if the walls devoured them. It was in these conditions that Elias began his diary, a small leather-bound volume he kept hidden beneath his straw mattress. His first entries spoke of longing for home, of the loneliness of the place, and of the cold that seeped through his robes at night. But as the weeks passed, his writing darkened, shifting from personal reflections to careful documentation. He sensed, as any thoughtful man would, that what happened at Briarcliff was not meant to be recorded, and so he recorded it. Elias wrote of a monk the others called only Brother Cornelius. Unlike the others, Cornelius wore no visible sign of his order. His robes were plain, unadorned by the customary cord or cross. He joined neither the morning prayers nor the evening vigils. At meals he sat apart, his bowl untouched, his gaze fixed on nothing, as if he saw through the walls themselves. Elias noted that Cornelius never entered the chapel, carrying a tray of food down the forbidden stairs. The monk who gave the order, a man named Father Damasus, whose breath smelled sharply of vinegar, offered no explanation. He merely handed Elias a wooden tray bearing 2 small bowls of thin broth and a crust of black bread. "For the ones downstairs," he said, his voice brittle with unease. The descent to the sub-basement was steeper than Elias had expected, the stairs uneven, carved directly into the bedrock. The air grew damp and fetid the deeper he went, until the scent of mould and decay was thick enough to taste. The light from his candle cast strange shadows along the walls, revealing the crude, ancient stonework beneath the monastery's later additions. He reached a low door of iron bars, more like a cell gate than a passage, and there he left the tray, as instructed. He heard nothing from within. No voice, no movement, only the faintest sound of breathing, ragged and slow, as if the occupants were too weak to do more. That night, Elias wrote of his unease. "I am told they fast in atonement," he penned, the words cramped in the flickering candlelight. "Yet why does it seem they are not permitted to die?" The months that followed were a study in slow, relentless dread. Elias's diary grew more meticulous, as if he hoped that by capturing the strangeness around him, he might impose some order upon it. He wrote of the sub-basement lights, small exposed bulbs that flickered at all hours, their hum barely masking the muffled sounds that rose from the depths, the soft scrape of chains, the low murmur of voices speaking in tongues he could not place. He described Brother Cornelius's nightly descents, how the man seemed to glide down the stairs, his bare feet soundless against the stone. There were other details, small but chilling in their consistency. The way the walls in certain parts of the monastery were warm to the touch, though no hearth or furnace lay nearby. The way certain doors bore deep gouges, as if someone or something had clawed at them in desperation. The way the monks averted their eyes whenever the subject of the basement arose, crossing themselves with trembling hands. On January 11th, Elias's diary abruptly ceased its careful daily cadence. The final entry was little more than a scrawl, the ink smudged as if written with shaking hands. It read, "I cannot stay. There are no prayers strong enough for this place." The official record states that Elias left Briarcliff the following morning, dismissed for what was termed spiritual impurity. No further details were provided, and his departure was swift. His belongings were packed under supervision. His diary, hidden in the lining of his battered suitcase, escaped detection only by chance, smuggled out beneath layers of cloth and worn leather. He never returned to the clergy, and in the years that followed, he spoke of Briarcliff to no one. It was not until 1982, when his few possessions were sorted after his untimely death in a roadside accident, that the diary came to light. Among the cracked spine and faded pages were his careful observations, unvarnished, clinical, and deeply unsettling. The text, now preserved in the state archives, remains one of the few contemporary accounts of what truly occurred within Briarcliff's walls during that cold winter. What makes this chapter in Briarcliff's history so profoundly disturbing is not what is known, but what remains hidden. The horror here was not one of frenzy or madness, but of order, of rituals carried out with deliberation, of suffering inflicted not in passion, but in cold calculation. The monks of Briarcliff did not see themselves as cruel. They believed they were caretakers of souls too broken or dangerous for the world above. And perhaps that is the most terrifying notion of all, that such evil can wear the mask of mercy. By the spring thaw of 1976, the monastery had resumed its quiet routine, as if Elias had never been there at all. The iron gate remained shut. The townsfolk who lived in the valley below saw no change in the shadow that Briarcliff cast upon the land. But beneath the chapel floor, the work continued. The archives grew heavier with records, the sub-basement colder with each passing year, and Brother Cornelius, the man with no name, remained at his post, descending those stairs night after night. In the next chapter of Briarcliff's grim history, we will examine the ledger books and procurement records that surfaced decades later, documents that suggest the monastery's true purpose was far removed from prayer or charity. The financial trail, long buried beneath layers of secrecy, tells a story that the monks themselves never intended the world to hear. The year was 1971, and the once imposing structure of Briarcliff Monastery stood weathered and hollow against the bleak horizon of eastern Vermont. Founded in 1892, Briarcliff had, for decades, been both a religious sanctuary and a shadowed refuge for society's unwanted, the mentally ill, the destitute, the criminally infirm. By the early 1970s, its sprawling stone wings and towering steeple had fallen into disrepair. The west wing, in particular, bore the scars of time most heavily. Cracks split the stone foundation. Ivy clawed at the barred windows. State inspectors, citing foundational instability and fire hazards, declared the wing condemned in the spring of that year. The order was clear: no one was to enter and no one was to remain. Yet despite the official decree, Briarcliff's west wing did not fall silent. Over the next several years, reports from the nearby village of Millfield began to circulate. Quiet at first, like whispers carried on the wind. Residents spoke of strange lights flickering behind the darkened windows of the west wing. Lights that sputtered and glowed in irregular patterns, as if powered by failing generators or unreliable wiring. Photographs taken in 1907, preserved now in the Millfield Historical Archives, capture these eerie illuminations, faint, pale rectangles of light against the deep black of night. In one particularly chilling image, taken on a fog-shrouded autumn evening, a solitary window on the upper floor of the west wing appears aglow. Behind its rusted bars, a silhouette can just be made out, a figure, motionless, watching. The villagers' accounts did not stop at the sight of lights. Time and again, they described hearing what they could only call chanting, low, rhythmic murmurs that seemed to rise from the monastery grounds after nightfall. The voices were indistinct, the language unfamiliar. Some believed it to be the prayers of remaining monks. Others, unwilling to entertain the idea that anyone still lived within those decaying walls, spoke of something darker, rituals perhaps, or the echo of suffering too great to be silenced by time. For many years, these stories remained the province of local legend, unsettling but unverifiable. That changed in 1994 with the emergence of a single, damning testimony. Thomas Varick had been just 17 when he arrived at Briarcliff in 1970, a novice seeking to dedicate his life to service. Now in his early 40s, Varick agreed to speak publicly for the first time as part of a regional historical project on vanished institutions. The interview, conducted under the stark light of a community hall in Millfield, was recorded on grainy VHS tape. What began as a quiet recollection of daily life at Briarcliff soon darkened into something far more disturbing. Varick described the West Wing in a manner no official record ever acknowledged. He spoke of its heavy oak doors, reinforced with iron bands and secured by rusting padlocks, of long corridors lined with rooms whose doors bore no handles on the inside, of beds outfitted not with bedding, but with metal restraints, leather cuffs affixed to the frame with cold steel rivets, feeding tubes mounted directly to the walls, their ends capped with dried residue. The air, he said, was always thick with the stench of antiseptic and human waste. What disturbed him most, he recalled, was the sound. The West Wing was never truly quiet. There was always the soft clink of chains against bed frames, the muted sobs of those confined within, and at times that same eerie chanting reported by the villagers, though to Varick it was no act of devotion. The voices came from behind the doors, from the patients themselves, their minds long since broken by isolation and restraint. The West Wing, Varick said, his voice trembling despite the decades that had passed, was for those the world didn't want anymore, the forgotten, the ones without names. There was one inmate, one more haunting than all the rest, a girl, perhaps 13 or 14 when Varick first saw her, though the years of malnourishment and neglect made it hard to tell. She was kept in a small cell at the far end of the wing, where the corridor narrowed and the walls felt as if they were closing in. Her hair was shorn close to the scalp. Her skin, pale as paper, bore bruises in various stages of healing. He never heard her speak. When he was tasked with delivering food or cleaning waste, she would simply stare, her eyes dull and empty, as if she had long since given up any hope of rescue. Her bed, he noted, was bolted to the floor. The restraints on her wrists and ankles were never removed, not even for meals. A feeding tube, cracked and stained from years of use, was her only nourishment. There was no medical file for this girl in Briarcliff's records. When Varick, naive and shaken, asked Brother Cornelius, the monk who alone carried the keys to the West Wing, who she was, the reply was chilling in its finality. She never existed. It was a phrase Varick would hear more than once during his time at Briarcliff, always in reference to those confined in the West Wing. The records, meticulously kept for other patients, made no mention of them. No admittance logs, no treatment notes, no discharge summaries. It was as if the wing itself had swallowed them whole. Brother Cornelius, Varick explained, had been with Briarcliff for nearly 40 years. A gaunt man with hollow cheeks and sunken eyes, he seemed to embody the decay of the building he guarded so fiercely. Cornelius held the only key that opened the West Wing's doors. Even the abbot deferred to him on matters concerning that part of the monastery. When questioned, Cornelius would speak of the West Wing as a necessary evil, a place to house the irredeemable, those too dangerous or too broken to live among the other patients. The horror of Briarcliff's West Wing lay not in sudden acts of violence or moments of madness, but in its grinding, institutional cruelty. The suffering there was not chaotic or frenzied. It was methodical, documented in the margins of ledgers that recorded only maintenance schedules and supply deliveries, never names or faces. And that, perhaps, is what makes this chapter of Briarcliff's history so difficult to reconcile. The atrocities were not hidden in the shadows. They were built into the architecture, sanctioned by silence and sustained by the complicity of those who looked away. The photographs, the testimony of Thomas Varec, and the fragments of forgotten records paint a chilling portrait. Briarcliff's West Wing was not abandoned in 1971. It continued to serve its grim purpose for years beyond its official closure. The lights that flickered behind the barred windows, the voices that murmured through the night, were not phantoms or figments. They were the last traces of those who had been erased from the world, victims of a system that saw them not as people, but as problems to be contained. As the years passed, the West Wing finally succumbed to time and neglect. The walls collapsed in places. The roof gave way. By the mid-1980s, access became impossible. And so, the secrets entombed within those crumbling stones remained sealed, beyond the reach of investigators, historians, or grieving families searching for answers. What makes this story particularly chilling is that it wasn't driven by the fervour of religious extremism, nor the chaos of war or revolution. It was, instead, the result of quiet bureaucracy, the calculated decision to remove those who did not fit, to erase them with locks and ledgers rather than blades or bullets. The horror of Briarcliff's West Wing is not that such things happened once, but that they could happen anywhere, given the right combination of power, neglect, and indifference. By the time Thomas Varec spoke out, the monastery had already been sold to private developers. The remaining structures were razed in 1997, leaving only fragments of foundation hidden beneath weeds and rubble. The land was cleared, the past buried along with it, but with the West Wing gone, a new chapter in the Briarcliff story would begin. Investigators, emboldened by Varec's account, turned their attention to the scattered records that remained, hoping, perhaps in vain, to piece together the fates of those the world had been told never existed. The year was 1978, tucked deep within the pine forests of Vermont, shielded from the eyes of the public by both geography and design. The Briarcliff Monastery presented itself to the world as a sanctuary. Its stone walls, weathered by over a century of wind and snow, gave the impression of quiet devotion, a place where lost souls might seek guidance, healing, or atonement. But within those walls, far from the idyllic image painted in diocesan pamphlets and charitable appeals, something far darker was unfolding. By then, Briarcliff no longer even pretended to speak the language of care. The monks who oversaw its daily operations had, in their internal memos, abandoned words like treatment, rehabilitation, or recovery. Instead, they used a term that was at once vague and absolute. They called it the discipline. To the unknowing, it suggested a noble austerity, a self-imposed rigour. But in practice, it concealed a programme of calculated cruelty, one designed not to heal, but to break. The discipline was not a single method, nor even a coherent philosophy. It was a patchwork of punishments, denials, and forced obedience, all dressed in the language of salvation. Patients, many of them children or adolescents, left at Briarcliff by families who could no longer manage them, were subjected to regimens that stripped away their senses, their autonomy, and, in time, their very sense of self. They were denied the most basic elements of human experience, not in moments of acute crisis, but as part of an enduring system. For some, it lasted weeks, for others, years. Evidence of these practices might have remained hidden forever, if not for a single file. An anonymous report smuggled out of the monastery and discovered years later, in 1991, during a broader investigation into diocesan archives. The file, stamped only with the words "confidential, internal use," contained a series of typewritten pages that would, at last, give names and dates to what survivors had long whispered about. The language of the report was chilling in its clinical detachment. There were no pleas for mercy, no sign that the author questioned the morality of what was being described. Instead, it read like a logbook of experiments. One line noted simply, 3-day blindfolds continued. Another, more cryptic, stated, "Exposure method successful for subject 6. A third detailed, "No water for 72 hours until submission." There was no elaboration on what exactly had constituted submission, only that the goal had been reached. What made the document especially disturbing was its ordinariness. The pages bore the marks of routine: coffee stains, a slight smudge from a finger dragged across wet ink. It was not a record of some singular moment of brutality. It was the paperwork of a system maintained day after day, year after year. Among the few outsiders to witness Briarcliff's methods firsthand was Dr. Evelyn Rosner. In the autumn of 1978, Rosner had arrived at the monastery under the auspices of a university fellowship. A promising young psychologist, she had been granted rare permission to observe the monks' work with what the monastery referred to as difficult cases. What she found, almost from the moment she arrived, was not therapy. It was something closer to sanctioned torment. In a statement preserved in the files of a later inquiry, Rosner described walking the silent halls of Briarcliff's western wing. There, she encountered the so-called repentance rooms, small windowless cells where patients were restrained against upright boards, their arms bound at their sides, their heads held forward by leather straps. Some were left for hours, others, Rosner believed, for days. She noted the faint smell of waste in the air, the way the boards themselves bore dark stains, where tears, sweat, or worse had been absorbed by the wood over time. On another occasion, Rosner witnessed a session in what the monks referred to as the chapel, though to her it felt more like an antechamber of submission. There, a group of heavily medicated patients, their movements sluggish and uncoordinated, were made to kneel in rows before an altar, stripped of all ornament. A monk, his face impassive, paced behind them, striking a wooden staff against the stone floor at irregular intervals. The sound echoed through the room, jarring and relentless. One by one, the patients collapsed, their bodies unable to bear the strain. No effort was made to assist them. They were simply left where they fell. The methods varied, but the aim was always the same: to erode the will, to enforce obedience through deprivation, isolation, and humiliation. The whistleblower's file included descriptions of prolonged sensory deprivation, patients blindfolded for days at a time, their ears packed with cotton to muffle sound. Forced silence was a common feature. In some sections of the monastery, speaking was forbidden entirely, save for recitations of scripture at designated hours. Those who broke the rule were subjected to additional punishments: cold baths in winter, meals withheld, isolation in darkness. What makes the story of Briarcliff's discipline especially chilling is not simply the suffering inflicted, but the institutional confidence with which it was carried out. The monks kept meticulous records. They measured the duration of punishments, the frequency of collapse, the speed with which a subject would comply following deprivation. They treated suffering not as an unfortunate byproduct, but as the instrument itself, the means by which the discipline was achieved. And while the monastery's outward face was one of charity and piety, its leaders worked carefully to ensure that what happened within its walls remained hidden. Financial records show substantial sums directed toward legal retainers and so-called charitable donations to local officials. Medical reports, when released at all, were sanitized to the point of meaninglessness. Those who emerged from Briarcliff often did so in silence, too broken or too frightened to speak of what had occurred. Yet, the fragments that did surface, the smuggled file, the testimony of Dr. Rosner, the quiet admissions of survivors, paint a clear and damning picture. Briarcliff was not a place where the vulnerable were cared for. It was a place where they were controlled, where suffering was engineered and maintained in the name of spiritual purity. The discipline was not the failure of a few misguided individuals. It was the design of an institution, perfected over decades, concealed behind stone walls and the language of salvation. Perhaps what is most terrifying about Briarcliff is this: there was no evil genius at its helm, no madman driving its cruelty. Instead, the horror arose from the ordinary, the quiet complicity of men who believed they were serving a higher good. The cold efficiency of systems designed to measure obedience, the indifference of those who might have intervened but chose not to see. It was not chaos, but order that made Briarcliff so deadly. As the 1970s came to a close, external pressures on institutions like Briarcliff began to mount. Changing laws, shifting public attitudes, and the growing strength of patients' rights movements made it increasingly difficult for such places to operate with impunity. But at Briarcliff, change came slowly, if at all. The monks tightened their control, retreating further from outside oversight, and behind their walls, the discipline continued. In the next chapter of this story, we will examine how that discipline began to unravel, not through conscience or reform, but through the quiet persistence of those who refused to let Briarcliff's secrets remain buried. It would be the actions of a few, archivists, journalists, and the survivors themselves, that would finally bring the hidden history of Briarcliff into the light. Between 1979 and 1983, the small New England town of Whitlock Hollow bore witness to a steady, almost imperceptible unravelling. At its centre stood Briarcliff Monastery, once a place of refuge, of quiet prayer and charity. But by the winter of 1979, something in its air had changed. The bells that had once marked the hours fell silent. The gardens, once meticulously kept, grew wild, overtaking the crumbling stone walls. The monastery's windows, tall, narrow slits of black glass, no longer flickered with candlelight at night. And the sound that was perhaps most haunting of all was the absence of sound itself. Briarcliff, once a place of community and comfort, had grown as quiet as a crypt. It was during these years that the disappearances began to accelerate. Briarcliff had always been a destination of last resort, taking in those society had cast off. The troubled, the ill, the unwanted. But between 1979 and 1983, the number of reported patients at the monastery fell by nearly 60%. No records indicated that these patients had been transferred. No death certificates were filed. There were no funerals, no farewells. They were simply gone. The official ledgers, preserved today in the state's historical archives, are as stark as they are chilling. Names crossed out, whole pages missing, medical records incomplete. In one case, that of 19-year-old Thomas Riley, admitted for what had been described as melancholia and outbursts, the final note in his file was a single word, scrawled hastily in the margin: departed. No date, no signature, no explanation. Yet, paradoxically, during this same period, donations to the monastery surged. Local banks recorded sizable endowments made anonymously, deposits so large they raised quiet concerns among a handful of clerks, though none dared question them openly. Tax records from the diocese show substantial sums earmarked for expansion projects. There was even mention in internal correspondence of a new dormitory, one supposedly built to house the influx of those seeking sanctuary. But no such structure was ever seen. No permits were filed with the town. Aerial photographs of the property, commissioned in 1982 by county surveyors, show nothing but the same weathered chapel and adjoining stone outbuildings. The land beyond remained untouched, choked with undergrowth. Those living closest to the monastery began to notice other peculiarities. The lights that once glowed softly in the chapel windows disappeared entirely. No one heard the choir rehearsing, no one saw the monks tending the grounds. Even the delivery men, who for years had brought supplies to the kitchens, reported that their orders were reduced until they were no longer called upon at all. It was in the autumn of 1981 that Father Brendan Donnelly, the parish priest of St Agnes, just 12 miles south of Briarcliff, first felt compelled to act. A mother had come to him after Mass, her face hollow with grief, her hands trembling as she clutched a faded photograph of her son. His name was Patrick Callahan, a boy of 17. She explained that Patrick had been struggling with what she could not say, only that his behaviour had grown erratic after his father's death. At the urging of their family doctor, Patrick had been admitted to Briarcliff. That was 3 months earlier. She had written letters, made phone calls, even travelled to the gates of the monastery itself. But no one answered. No one came. Father Donnelly, bound by both conscience and duty, penned a formal inquiry to the diocesan office. His letter was polite but direct, requesting clarification on Patrick's whereabouts and expressing concern for the boy's welfare. 2 weeks later, the letter was returned, unopened. A single word had been stamped across the envelope in red ink: resolved. But Father Donnelly did not let the matter rest. He began his own quiet investigation, reaching out to families who, like Patrick's, had entrusted their loved ones to Briarcliff's care. Over the next several months, he documented the cases of 5 such families, each with a son or daughter admitted between 1976 and 1982. A young woman named Eleanor Voss, committed for hysterics after a failed engagement. A boy named Samuel Grady, sent away at age 16 after a series of petty thefts. A farmer's son, Peter Sloan, whose mind had been fractured following a childhood accident. In every case, the pattern was the same. The family sent their child to Briarcliff, desperate for help, and in every case, that child was never seen again. Donnelly kept meticulous notes. He collected copies of admission papers, letters sent to the monastery that were never answered, statements from family members who described the growing dread that had settled over their homes. He stored these documents in a locked drawer in the rectory office, alongside his personal Bible. In early 1982, Donnelly resolved to confront the monastery directly. But before he could do so, tragedy intervened. On a frigid February morning, the rectory housekeeper arrived to find his office ransacked. The drawer where he kept his notes stood open, empty. The lock had been broken cleanly, as if by someone who knew precisely what they were looking for. His Bible was gone as well. It would be months before the remnants of that Bible surfaced, discovered at the bottom of an old well near the monastery ruins by a group of boys hunting rabbits. The leather cover was scorched, blackened along the edges, the gold lettering barely legible. The pages inside had been torn out, the binding left ragged and empty. The well itself had long been dry, a forgotten relic of the monastery's earliest days, choked now with debris and dead leaves. What compelled the boys to look inside that morning was never clear, but what they found was undeniable. By the end of 1983, the monastery had grown so silent, so lifeless, that it seemed no one remained within its walls. The disappearances, the erasures, the unanswered questions, all had culminated in a darkness that felt absolute. And yet the money continued to flow. The diocese, when questioned in later years, maintained that Briarcliff had been a place of charity and healing until the end. But the records, or what little remained of them, told a different story, a story of absences, of names crossed out, of children abandoned not by their families, but by the very institution that had sworn to protect them. What makes this chapter of Briarcliff's history particularly chilling is that it wasn't driven by the passions of zealots or the chaos of war. It was not the work of madmen or monsters of folklore. No, it was something far colder, far more calculating, a systematic removal of the vulnerable, carried out in the shadows of respectability. And when those with the power to question it tried, as Father Donnelly had, they too were silenced. The horror of Briarcliff lies not in what was done, but in how easily it was hidden, how thoroughly it was forgotten. By 1984, Briarcliff Monastery stood empty. The buildings fell further into ruin, the walls buckling under the weight of time and neglect. But beneath the crumbling stone and rotting wood, the questions remained. Where had they gone? What had been done within those walls? And perhaps most haunting of all, who had allowed it? In the years that followed, rumours would swirl of hidden chambers, of mass graves, of secrets buried deep beneath the earth. But the official record would remain silent, and so too would those who might have known the truth. With Briarcliff abandoned, the story shifted. Attention turned to the land itself, to what might lie beneath the cracked flagstones and overgrown gardens. For if the walls of Briarcliff could no longer hide its secrets, the earth itself would be left to keep them. In the autumn of 1997, the last surviving walls of Briarcliff were scheduled to fall. The once feared asylum, abandoned for decades, had long since rotted into a shell of mildew-stained brick and fractured plaster. For years, it had loomed over the outskirts of Stoneham, Massachusetts, casting its long shadow over the town's collective memory. The decision to finally raise the structure came not from any sense of closure or justice, but from a simple, pragmatic need to clear the land for development. A private demolition crew, hired with little fanfare, arrived on the grounds that October, their machines growling to life at dawn beneath a pallid sky. They began their work as so many had before, pulling down the patient wings first, where rusted gurneys and shattered window panes bore silent witness to the institution's past. The crew found nothing remarkable at first: remnants of collapsed staircases, file cabinets gutted by time, fragments of old uniforms reduced to threads. But on the fourth day, as they set about dismantling what had once been Briarcliff's chapel, they uncovered something no one had anticipated. Beneath the crumbling remains of the baptismal font, a cracked marble basin that had presided over decades of hollow ceremonies, the floor gave way. The men had expected nothing more than a shallow crawl space, perhaps a disused cistern. Instead, their jackhammers revealed a sealed hatch of heavy oak, reinforced with iron straps, blackened by age. The air that escaped when they pried it open was bitterly cold and carried a stench that none of them could later describe without a visible shudder. One by one, they lowered themselves into the dark. What they found beneath the font was a room measuring barely 15 feet across, the ceiling pressed low, forcing even the shortest of them to stoop. The walls were of rough stone, slick with moisture, their surfaces pocked with nail holes and gouges where hooks had once been fixed. 7 bed frames, reduced to rust and splinters, were bolted to the floor in precise alignment. Shackles dangled from the head and foot of each, the iron eaten through, in places but still recognisable. Against one wall, a dry sink was set into a crude counter. The basin was badly stained. The dark residue baked into the porcelain, as if scrubbed and scrubbed, but never clean. In the far corner, beneath the collapsed edge of the hatchway, sat a plastic milk crate. Inside were 3 VHS tapes, their labels long since yellowed. Across each, in trembling black marker, was written a single word: training. The tapes were taken into evidence, though no law enforcement agency ever claimed jurisdiction over what they contained. The footage was never made public, but the transcripts, typed up by a clerk who reportedly resigned the day after, are preserved in the state archives. They describe grainy black and white images of Brother Cornelius himself, seated before the very bed frames found in the chamber. His robes are immaculate, his voice steady, measured, without trace of hesitation. On the first tape, he speaks of cleansing pain, a philosophy that he claims is rooted in the early monastic orders, but warped beyond recognition. Pain, he says, is the fire through which the unworthy self is burned away, leaving the soul naked before God. His expression remains serene as he gestures toward the shackles, demonstrating their use as dispassionately as one might demonstrate a tool. On the second tape, the language grows darker. Cornelius describes annihilating identity, a process, he asserts, by which the stubborn will of the individual can be dissolved entirely. His words are clinical, almost tender, as he outlines techniques of sensory deprivation, enforced silence and isolation. By the third tape, his teachings have turned fully to domination. The mind, he intones, delivered back to God, empty, is a vessel fit for holy purpose. It was this room, hidden beneath the sacred rites of baptism, that confirmed the darkest suspicions about Briarcliff. This had never been about salvation. It had never been about faith. The chapel, the rituals, the prayers, they had been a mask. Beneath it lay control, absolute and merciless. Those who entered this chamber were not offered grace. They were erased. 2 survivors, whose identities remain protected, their names changed in the public record, spoke of what they remembered. The first, referred to only as David, described waking in the room, his wrists raw against cold iron. He spoke of the sink's constant drip, the scrape of unseen vermin in the walls, the smell, acrid, metallic, unforgettable. David bore the scars still, deep circular impressions around his wrists, scar tissue where the shackles had cut to bone. He did not remember leaving, only that he awoke one morning, alone on the chapel floor, his body broken, his mind hollowed out. The second survivor, called Elena, had no scars to show, but what she lacked in visible wounds, she carried in voice and bearing. When interviewed, she would not raise her head. Her voice, when it came at all, never rose above a whisper. She spoke of the darkness, of the sound of chains dragged across stone, of the hymns sung softly in the distance, as if mocking. Like David, she did not remember how she escaped, only that one day the door had been left ajar, and she had crawled into the light, eyes nearly blind from months, perhaps years, of shadow. What makes this story particularly chilling is that it was not driven by religious fervour, nor even by greed. It was driven by the quiet, relentless hunger for control. The chamber beneath the font was the heart of Briarcliff's horror, a place where unwanted children, the mentally ill, the outcast, were stripped of identity and voice. The tools of their erasure were not arcane. They were shackles, isolation, deprivation, and the ones who wielded them did so not in the heat of passion, but with cold deliberation, convinced of their righteousness. When the room was finally unearthed, its contents catalogued and its tapes transcribed, the truth stood revealed. It was worse than any rumour, any theory whispered in the town's bars or around campfires. Briarcliff had not been a place of healing. It had been a machine for unmaking, hidden in plain sight beneath the trappings of piety. The demolition crew, their task completed, left the site to the developers. The chamber was filled in, sealed beneath concrete and steel. Today, an office park stands on the ground where Briarcliff once loomed. But those who know the history say that, on quiet nights, the wind through the parking lot carries a sound like chains dragging across stone. With the last secrets of the baptismal chamber laid bare, the story of Briarcliff turned to its final silent chapter, the long unmarked graves beyond the northern wall, where the institution's victims were laid to rest without name or ceremony. And it is there that our next journey takes us. The year was 1983, after decades marked by mounting allegations of abuse, corruption, and the quiet disappearance of patients. Briarcliff Asylum was officially shuttered. The state declared the institution irredeemable, citing structural disrepair, fiscal mismanagement, and gross ethical failures. But as the iron gates clanged shut and the last of the staff departed, what many believed was the end of Briarcliff was in truth merely a pause. The horrors that had defined that place did not die with the institution's closure. They simply moved. A review of state contracts from the mid-1980s, documents brittle with age, their ink faded but legible, reveals a strange pattern. Names familiar to those who studied Briarcliff's inner workings began to appear again, this time connected to an obscure facility in northern New Mexico. The site was called Our Lady of the Vale, a former monastery turned private hospital, situated on 300 acres of scrubland miles from the nearest town. Its founding charter bore the same signatures that had authorized Briarcliff's operations. Among them, Father Declan Murphy, Sister Ignatia Bell, and most disturbingly, Brother Cornelius Harrow. Officially, Brother Cornelius's death had been recorded in late 1982, mere months before Briarcliff's closure. The certificate, filed hastily with the county clerk, was signed by a physician who would later be disbarred for falsifying autopsies. No body was ever buried, no funeral was ever held, and yet no one questioned the record. To the public, Brother Cornelius was gone. To those who knew where to look, he had simply vanished. Our Lady of the Vale opened its doors quietly in 1984. It received no press, there was no grand ceremony, no announcement in the diocesan bulletins. The patients came slowly at first, transfers from overcrowded state hospitals, the indigent and unwanted, the mentally ill without families to speak for them. The facility was funded largely through private donations and unremarkable state contracts, hidden within larger budgets for rural health initiatives. It presented itself as a sanctuary, but what occurred inside its walls bore the unmistakable mark of Briarcliff's legacy. Decades later, in the spring of 1997, a former nurse at a New Mexico state hospital came forward with a troubling memory. Her name was withheld from the public record at her request, but the affidavit remained sealed in the state archives. She described a visit to Our Lady of the Vale to deliver medical supplies. As she waited in the entry hall, a cavernous space that smelled of bleach and stale incense, she noticed a man descending a narrow staircase. He was dressed in plain clerical robes. His eyes, she said, were what she remembered most. One dark brown, the other pale and clouded, and his voice, when he greeted her, was soft, without accent or regional inflection. She would later say that hearing it filled her with a cold sense of dread. She had seen photographs of Brother Cornelius once, in a training seminar on institutional abuse. She believed, without doubt, that the man she saw was him. The records of Our Lady of the Vale are sparse. Its administrative files, those made available to state oversight agencies, show nothing more sinister than budget reports, maintenance logs, and patient censuses. But these documents tell only part of the story. By piecing together transfer records, insurance filings, and occasional mentions in diocesan directories, we know that at least 199 individuals were committed to the care of Our Lady of the Vale between 1984 and 2001. They were not all children. The youngest recorded was a boy of 7, diagnosed with a developmental disorder. The oldest was an 87-year-old woman, listed as a ward of the state, with no surviving relatives. Many were simply poor or abandoned or deemed inconvenient by the institutions that sent them there, and almost all of them disappeared into silence. It is the realization that evil, when given the machinery of bureaucracy, can migrate. It can rebrand itself. It can endure. Briarcliff's closure did not destroy what it represented. Instead, it provided cover for its fragments to scatter, to take root elsewhere, hidden beneath layers of paperwork and the complicity of those who preferred not to see. The architecture of horror does not need walls of stone to persist. It survives in ledgers, in titles, in the subtle reshaping of an institution's mission statement. Our Lady of the Vale remains standing today. From the air, it looks unremarkable. A cluster of low buildings surrounded by desert. The chapel's bell tower, though weathered by decades of sun and wind, still casts its long shadow over the grounds. The facility continues to operate under private management, its records sealed, its purpose ambiguous. No charges have ever been brought against it. No inquiry has ever been sustained. And so, the story of Briarcliff does not end with a ruined asylum on a Massachusetts hill. Its legacy lingers in places few think to look. In quiet corners of the world, institutions endure where no one should have ever been.